My name is Amber. At 33 years old, I found myself locked inside my own freezing home, gasping for air with a 103-degree fever, while my husband boarded a flight for a luxury European vacation. He took my credit cards, hid my life-saving medication, and cut off the power and water, leaving me completely trapped. He thought I would quietly fade away in the dark. He had no idea what was waiting for him when he finally returned 27 days later. If you have ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the person who promised to protect you, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will not want to miss how I dismantled his entire life piece by piece. The relentless cold was the first thing that registered. It was a bone-deep chill radiating from the very walls, sinking into my skin. I woke up shivering so violently that my teeth chattered. My body felt like it was on fire, yet the air around me was like a freezer. My skin was burning. I did not need a thermometer to know my fever had spiked dangerously high. I tried to pull the heavy-down comforter closer, but my muscles felt completely drained. Then came the desperate need for air. I opened my mouth to take a deep breath, but my lungs refused to expand properly. A severe lung infection had been ravaging my body for 3 days, leaving me bedridden and dependent on my husband Trevor. I gasped, a harsh rattling sound echoing in the utter silence. The house was dead quiet. I fumbled blindly across the mattress, searching for Harrison. The sheets on his side of the bed were perfectly smooth and freezing cold. He was not there. Panic began to flutter in my chest, competing with the physical pain of my restricted breathing. I needed my emergency inhaler. I needed the strong antibiotics my doctor had prescribed just yesterday afternoon. I slowly swung my legs over the edge of the large mattress, praying for just a tiny fraction of my normal physical energy to return to me. As my bare feet touched the hardwood floor, a shock of icy cold shot up my legs. I grabbed the edge of the nightstand to steady myself. I forced myself to stand up straight. The incredibly short walk to the master bathroom felt like a grueling marathon. I flipped the light switch out of sheer habit. Nothing happened. The power was completely out. A sliver of pale moonlight filtered through the frosted glass window, casting long, eerie shadows across the marble tiles. I guided myself toward the vanity, my breathing becoming more shallow and frantic. I just needed one puff from the inhaler to open my airways. I reached out with a shaking hand to open the mirrored medicine cabinet. I ran my hand along the bottom shelf where I always kept my daily prescriptions. My fingers brushed against empty glass. I patted the second shelf, then the third. Nothing. The entire cabinet was completely bare. My antibiotics, the emergency inhaler, everything was gone. I stood there in the dark, my feverish brain struggling to process the empty shelves. I turned around and stumbled back into the bedroom, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my aching ribs. I needed my phone. I patted down the tangled blankets until my fingers brushed against the smooth glass screen of my smartphone. As I picked it up, the screen illuminated, casting a harsh blue light into the dark room. The battery icon glowed at a dangerously low 15%. There was a single unread text message waiting on the lock screen. It was from Harrison. I swiped to open it, my eyes watering from the sudden brightness. Mom, Rachel and I just boarded our flight to Europe for our 27-day family trip. I took your credit cards, so you do not deliriously online shop. Also, I shut off the power, water, and heat through the house controls. No sense paying for it since you will just be sleeping. Uber to a clinic if you must, but do not ruin our trip by texting me. I read the message again, and then a third time, my mind refusing to accept the sheer cruelty of his words. He had left. My husband of 4 years, the man who had vowed to protect and cherish me, had boarded an international flight with his mother and his sister while I was fighting for my life in our bedroom. He knew exactly how sick I was. He had been standing right next to me when the doctor warned us about the severity of the lung infection and the critical importance of staying warm and medicated. Instead of caring for me, he had meticulously planned my suffering. He had taken my credit cards to strip away my financial access. He had deliberately hidden or thrown away my life-saving medication. He had actually contacted the utility companies to cut off the power and the water to our home in the middle of a brutal cold snap. He had left me in a freezing dark house with no medicine, no heat, and no running water, casually telling me to order a ride share to a clinic as if it were a minor inconvenience. A fresh wave of coughing overtook me, doubling me over. The text message had confirmed my worst fears, but it also ignited a primal instinct for survival. I could not stay in this freezing room. I needed to get out to the street where someone could call an ambulance. I dropped the phone into my pocket and forced myself to move. Every step required monumental effort. My legs trembled violently, and my breath came in short, ragged wheezes. I leaned against the banister, slowly navigating the stairs down to the first floor. The indoor temperature was dropping rapidly, exacerbating my violent shivering. I staggered toward the heavy oak front door. Our home was equipped with a state-of-the-art smart lock system. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The digital keypad beeped sharply and flashed a bright crimson red. I punched in my personal 4-digit access code. Access denied. A cold realization washed over me, chilling me deeper than the freezing air. The smart lock system was connected to the home network, but it also had a cellular backup for administrative control. Harrison held the primary administrative rights on his phone. He had not just cut the power and taken my medication. He had remotely changed the access codes and engaged the heavy internal deadbolts. I grabbed the solid brass door handle and pulled with all the meager strength I had left. It did not budge a single millimeter. I pushed against the heavy wood, slamming my aching shoulder into the doorframe, but it was entirely useless. I was completely and physically locked in. I stumbled backward in defeat, my legs finally giving out completely. I collapsed onto the cold entryway floor, my back resting against the wall. The reality of my situation crashed down on me with suffocating weight. My husband had abandoned me, stripped away my resources, and trapped me inside a freezing, powerless house while I was critically ill. He had left me to succumb to a severe infection entirely alone in the dark. I lay there on the cold, unforgiving entryway floor, letting the incredibly harsh reality of Trevor's absolute betrayal wash completely over me. The freezing air was biting through my pajamas, and my chest burned with a deep, searing ache every time I tried to inhale. He truly thought he had me completely and hopelessly trapped inside a powerless house while he flew across the ocean to enjoy a luxurious European vacation. For years, my husband had made an absolute sport out of belittling my intelligence. At social gatherings, he loved to tell his friends that I just played with spreadsheets all day. He would laugh his condescending laugh and tell everyone I was basically a glorified bookkeeper. I always smiled politely and let him talk. He had absolutely no idea about the actual depth of my expertise. I was not a simple bookkeeper. I was a top-tier forensic accountant and a financial systems auditor for some of the largest corporate networks in the country. Trevor thought changing the administrative codes on our residential smart home network would be enough to lock me in and secure his getaway. He severely underestimated my capabilities. Breaking out of my own house was simply a matter of getting to my professional equipment before my skyrocketing fever caused me to lose consciousness. I pressed my palms flat against the freezing hardwood floor and forced myself to crawl down the hallway. A wave of agonizing dizziness crashed through my skull. My vision blurred and a violent fit of coughing racked my body, leaving me gasping for air. Every inch forward required a monumental effort of sheer will. I thought about Trevor sitting comfortably in a first-class airplane seat, entirely unbothered by the fact that he had left his wife to die. That thought alone fueled my determination. I was certainly not going to simply become another silent victim of his monstrous and calculating cruelty. When I finally reached the office door, I turned the knob and fell into the room, my shoulders slamming against the carpet. I pulled myself up using the heavy mahogany desk. I did not bother trying to turn on my main desktop computer because the power grid was dead. Instead, I reached underneath the bottom drawer and pressed my fingers against a false panel I had installed years ago. I popped the panel loose and pulled out a heavy waterproof protective case. Inside was my hidden backup laptop, fully charged and loaded with localized bypass tools I used exclusively for high-level corporate security audits. Trevor had no idea this machine existed. I opened the laptop, the bright screen illuminating the dark room. I pulled a specialized hardwiring cable from the case and crawled over to the smart home hub mounted near the wall. I bypassed the wireless network, completely plugging my laptop directly into the physical access port. My fingers were stiff and numb from the cold, making it difficult to type, but muscle memory took over. I opened a command terminal and ran a localized override script, slicing through the basic consumer-grade encryption Trevor had relied on. It took me less than 3 minutes to strip away his administrative access. I deleted his profile from the master control system entirely and reassigned the root permissions to my own encrypted credentials. The dashboard confirmed that Trevor had shut down the furnace water valves and internal power controls through the smart home hub. With a few swift keystrokes, I restored those essential systems. Then I targeted the security locks. I highlighted the heavy deadbolts he had engaged on the front and back doors and executed the unlock command. The loud, satisfying sound of the heavy metal deadbolts sliding open echoed through the quiet house. I was no longer trapped. I had broken his cage. I disconnected the cable and let my head fall back against the wall, my breathing growing increasingly shallow and erratic. The edges of the room began to darken, the fever threatening to pull me under. I reached back into the hidden compartment under my desk and pulled out a small prepaid burner phone. I kept it specifically for emergencies and secure client communications. Since Trevor had likely compromised my primary cell phone network, I could not risk using it to call for help. I dialed the direct emergency number for an exclusive private medical concierge service I retained for my firm. I gave the dispatcher my address and account identification, my voice barely a raspy whisper. I told them I was suffering from a severe lung infection, experiencing a dangerously high fever, and needed an emergency medical transport immediately. The dispatcher assured me an ambulance was already on the way and instructed me to stay near the unlocked front door. Before leaving the office, I slid the laptop and burner phone back into the protective case and dragged it with me toward the entryway. I do not remember crawling back down the hallway to the entryway. My memory of those final minutes is disjointed and hazy, colored by the intense heat of my fever and the agonizing tightness in my chest. I remember the sound of heavy boots on the porch. I remember the front door swinging open, letting in a rush of freezing outside air. I remember the bright flash of medical flashlights shining into my eyes. Strong hands lifted me from the cold floor. A paramedic wrapped me in heated thermal blankets, the sudden warmth feeling almost painful against my freezing skin. Another paramedic quickly placed an oxygen mask over my nose and mouth, delivering a steady flow of cool, life-saving air into my burning lungs. They loaded me onto a stretcher and wheeled me out of the dark, lifeless house. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance illuminated the quiet suburban street. As they secured me in the back of the ambulance, a paramedic quickly started an intravenous line in my arm, administering fluids and a heavy dose of fever-reducing medication. I lay back against the hospital gurney, taking deep, greedy breaths of the pure oxygen. I closed my eyes, letting the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor ground me in reality. I was safe. I had survived his trap. As the ambulance pulled away from the curb, the siren wailing into the night, I felt a vibration in my pajama pocket. It was my primary cell phone. I reached down with a weak, trembling hand and pulled it out. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was not from Trevor. It was from my mother-in-law, Linda. She had always made it a point to undermine me, constantly criticizing my appearance and my career. She was the one who had raised Trevor to believe he was entitled to everything. I stared at her name on the screen, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. I swiped the notification to read the message. Try not to be such a dramatic burden while we are gone, Amber. Make sure you do not ruin Trevor's vacation with your constant complaining. He works hard to provide for you, and he deserves this luxury trip. I read those incredibly cold and callous words. She knew. She knew exactly how sick I was. She knew her son had taken my medication, locked me in a freezing house, and left me completely incapacitated. And she was actively mocking me for it from the comfort of her first-class seat. She was completely complicit in all of his calculated cruelty. I slowly let the phone drop onto the heavy blanket covering my chest. The medication the paramedics had administered was beginning to take effect, dulling the sharp edges of my physical pain. The violent shivering slowly began to subside, replaced by a deep, terrifying calm. They truly thought they had completely broken me. They honestly thought I was incredibly weak and utterly helpless. They had absolutely no idea that they had just willingly given me every single reason I needed to completely dismantle their entire lives today. I stared at Linda's mocking text message on my primary phone screen as the ambulance sped through the dark streets. Try not to be such a dramatic burden while we are gone. The callousness of her words echoed in my feverish mind, while the paramedics worked urgently around me. The ambulance tires hissed against the damp asphalt as we pulled into the discreet, brightly lit loading bay of the Oakwood Medical Concierge. It was an exclusive private clinic nestled in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb, far removed from the chaotic emergency rooms of the public city hospitals. My firm retained a corporate membership here for our executive team, guaranteeing immediate, unquestioned, and highly confidential medical care at any hour of the day or night. The paramedics smoothly guided my stretcher through the pristine glass automatic doors, seamlessly transferring my care to a waiting team of specialized doctors and nurses. The stark contrast between the freezing dark tomb of my house and the warm, sterile efficiency of the clinic was jarring. A senior physician immediately began assessing my vitals, while a nurse adjusted my oxygen flow and hung a fresh bag of intravenous antibiotics. They moved with practiced urgency, their hushed professional voices a soothing hum in my feverish ears. Before they moved me to a private recovery suite, the clinic administrator stepped into the triage bay holding a sleek digital tablet. She wore a sympathetic but firm expression, standard protocol for a facility that did not process traditional health insurance. She quietly informed me that the emergency transport, the after-hours admission, and the intensive respiratory treatment protocol required a substantial upfront retainer. Trevor had always handled our visible household finances, taking immense pride in managing the joint checking accounts and paying the bills from his corporate salary. He truly believed I was entirely dependent on his income for anything beyond basic groceries and gas. I did not know about the secure digital wallet installed on my burner phone. I weakly raised my hand and tapped the phone against the administrator tablet. The encrypted transaction processed, instantly transferring $10,000 from a heavily guarded offshore account directly to the clinic. I had spent years building a formidable wall of financial security completely invisible to my husband, a safety net funded by my high-level corporate consulting fees. The administrator smiled politely, handed me a digital receipt, and stepped aside so the medical team could wheel me down the quiet carpeted hallway. They settled me into a spacious, softly lit room that felt more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital ward. The nurses draped me in heated blankets and continuously monitored my oxygen saturation, while the powerful combination of fluids, steroids, and antibiotics slowly worked their way through my bloodstream. For the first few hours, I simply existed in a state of suspended animation, floating in and out of a heavy medicated sleep. The burning agony in my chest gradually began to subside, giving way to a dull, manageable ache. The violent shivering stopped entirely. As the darkest hours of the night crept toward early morning, my fever finally broke. I woke up with my hospital gown clinging to my damp skin, taking my first deep, unobstructed breath in days. The physical relief was immediate and profound, but it was nothing compared to the sharp, intense clarity that suddenly washed over my mind. The thick fog of illness and panic lifted, leaving behind a cold, crystalline focus. I lay perfectly still in the quiet room, staring up at the smooth white ceiling. I did not feel the crushing, devastating heartbreak of a betrayed wife. I did not feel the urge to cry or to scream or to frantically call my husband and beg for an explanation. The time for tears had evaporated the moment I realized he had deliberately taken my medication. What I felt instead was a deep, calculated anger, a quiet and terrifying rage that settled into my bones. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my primary cell phone. I pulled up Linda's mocking text message and stared at the words until they burned into my memory. Try not to be such a dramatic burden while we are gone. I analyzed the phrasing, dissecting the implication behind her cruel remark. This was not a spontaneous decision on Trevor's part. The sheer logistics required to execute his departure meant it had been meticulously planned for weeks. He had to coordinate the international flights, arrange the extended time off from his firm, and organize the travel itinerary with his mother and his sister Rachel. But the most damning realization was the immediate tactical nature of my abandonment. Trevor could not have effortlessly hidden my prescribed antibiotics and my emergency inhaler, contacted the utility providers to initiate a total service blackout, and reprogram the central smart home network all by himself. He needed significant time and uninterrupted privacy in the few hours since my fever spiked. Linda and Rachel had to have known exactly what he was doing. They were fully aware that I was battling a severe, life-threatening lung infection. They knew I was physically incapacitated and utterly reliant on that specific medication to breathe. They had actively watched him strip away my ability to survive, and they had eagerly boarded a luxury flight with him anyway. They had deliberately weaponized my physical vulnerability, orchestrating a scenario where I would be far too weak to interfere with whatever they were doing overseas. My husband and my in-laws had conspired to leave me locked in a freezing house to die simply because my illness was an inconvenience to their grand plans. The morning sun began to filter through the heavy privacy blinds, casting a pale golden light across the pristine hospital bed. A gentle knock on the heavy wooden door interrupted my thoughts. A young, softly spoken nurse entered the room carrying a large plastic belongings bag. She explained that the paramedics had collected my personal items from the entryway floor before transporting me. I thanked her quietly and waited until she checked my vitals, recorded my improved temperature, and left the room. I pulled the plastic bag onto my lap and reached inside. My fingers bypassed the charger wrapping firmly around the cold, solid metal of my encrypted backup laptop. I pulled the heavy machine free and rested it gently against my knees. I slowly pushed myself up into a seated position. I was still physically weak, and my lungs ached with every breath, but my mind was operating at absolute peak efficiency. Trevor had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He believed his meek spreadsheet-pushing wife would simply curl up and accept her fate in the dark. He thought he had outsmarted me by taking my credit cards and locking the doors. But he had forgotten the most fundamental rule of the digital age. Every action, every purchase, every hidden motive, and every secret plan leaves a digital footprint. I opened the laptop, the bright screen illuminating my face in the quiet hospital room. I connected to the clinic network and launched my specialized tracking software. I was not going to waste energy crying over a man who had left me for dead. I was going to do what I did best. I placed my hands over the keyboard, my fingers hovering above the keys. I was going to follow the money and find out what was waiting for him in Europe. I connected my encrypted laptop to the secure network my firm provided and immediately initiated a virtual private network tunnel to mask my digital presence. Trevor had always been incredibly arrogant about his intelligence, but he was fundamentally lazy when it came to digital security. He used the exact same variation of his birth year and our wedding anniversary for almost every single password he possessed. I did not even need to run a complex brute force decryption program to bypass his primary safeguards. I simply navigated to his main personal banking portal and keyed in the familiar string of numbers and letters. The screen refreshed almost instantly, and I was securely inside his master financial dashboard. I pulled up the joint checking account first. Trevor had proudly insisted on managing this specific account to pay our household expenses and manage our standard monthly budget. As I slowly scrolled through the transaction history, my eyes narrowed at the rapidly depleting balance. This was absolutely not the financial footprint of a simple family vacation to visit historical landmarks and take a few guided tours. The numbers bleeding out of the account were staggering and entirely reckless. I opened a blank digital ledger on a secondary monitor and began meticulously categorizing the outbound cash flow. The first major red flag was an ongoing series of massive transactions originating in Paris. My mother-in-law Linda and my sister-in-law Rachel had apparently wasted no time indulging themselves the very moment their flight landed. I tracked sequential charges at several high-end designer boutiques along the most expensive shopping districts in France. There were thousands upon thousands of dollars spent on luxury leather goods, imported cosmetics, and expensive silk garments. Trevor was happily funding an absolute shopping spree for his mother and sister, while I was lying in a hospital bed with an intravenous line stitched into my arm. But the retail shopping charges, as infuriating and selfish as they were, paled in comparison to the extravagant hospitality expenses. Trevor had booked the three of them into a five-star luxury resort that cost well over $2,000 a night. They were currently dining at Michelin-starred restaurants and charging exorbitant spa treatments directly to the hotel room. He was aggressively burning through his liquid assets at an alarming rate, but it was the very next discovery that truly made my blood run cold. As I continued to audit the recent wire transfers, I noticed a glaring anomaly buried deep beneath the standard international conversion fees. 5 days before he left me to freeze in our dark house, Trevor had authorized a massive outgoing wire transfer. The amount was exactly $50,000. It was sent directly to a private international holding company based in Italy. I ran the receiving routing numbers through a specialized corporate tracking database I used for my forensic investigations at work. The holding company belonged to a highly exclusive luxury property management group that handled elite private estates specifically located in Lake Como. You do not spend $50,000 to simply rent a villa for a few days of casual sightseeing. That kind of money reserved a venue for a major high society event. Trevor was a mid-level regional sales manager, not a billionaire. He had effectively drained his personal savings and severely leveraged our joint accounts to make this single, non-refundable payment. My mind raced through the countless possibilities. Why would my husband secretly secure one of the most expensive and romantic destinations in all of Europe while lying about a standard family trip? I needed far more context, so I shifted my intense focus from his banking portal directly to his synchronized cloud storage account. I knew Trevor faithfully backed up his personal phone every night at 2 in the morning. I accessed the cloud drive using his credentials and downloaded the entire backup archive directly to my secure local hard drive. I sorted the thousands of files by the most recent modifications, completely ignoring his mundane work documents and his endless golf trip photos. I was hunting for the hidden folders, the ones he thought he had cleverly buried deep within the complex system directories. I found a nested folder labeled simply with the current year. I clicked it open, and my high-definition screen flooded with hundreds of high-resolution images and downloaded email attachments. I opened the first document, which appeared to be a meticulously detailed event itinerary. The header of the page featured an elegant, sweeping calligraphy font outlining a week-long celebration at a famous historical villa in Lake Como. I read through the scheduled events with a growing sense of absolute dread. There was a catered welcome dinner, a private sunset boat cruise across the lake, and a grand formal reception. It read exactly like a luxury wedding itinerary. I minimized the document and clicked on the very next file in the folder. It was a forwarded email confirmation from an exclusive bridal boutique located in downtown Chicago. The subject line read, "Final fitting and delivery confirmation." I opened the attached digital receipt and felt all the air leave my lungs in a sudden painful rush. It was an itemized invoice for a custom-tailored designer wedding gown. The total cost was $12,000 paid in full, using a secondary credit card I had not yet identified in my initial financial sweep. I slowly scrolled down to the bottom of the lengthy invoice, where the boutique tailor had documented the final alteration measurements. I stared blankly at the specific numbers glowing on the screen. The waist and bust measurements belonged to a woman who was significantly shorter and much more petite than I was. This incredibly expensive dress would never fit me. It would never fit his mother Linda, and it certainly would not fit his sister Rachel. My husband had purchased a $12,000 wedding gown for another woman. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening clarity. He was not just cheating on me, he was starting an entirely new life while actively attempting to end mine. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was almost too massive to fully comprehend. He had stolen my vital medication and locked me inside a freezing house to ensure I could not uncover his lies or interrupt his beautiful Italian wedding. I sat alone in the quiet hospital room, the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor reminding me that I was still very much alive. I looked back at the screen, committing the name of the bridal boutique and the total cost of the gown to my memory. He had paid for his new bride dress with funds that should have belonged to our household. I closed the receipt and opened another file, determined to find the identity of the woman who was currently planning to walk down the aisle with my husband. Every single document I uncovered was another nail in his proverbial coffin. I was no longer just the sick wife he had left behind. I was the financial auditor who was about to dismantle his entire world. I carefully saved the digital receipts to an encrypted external drive. He thought he was absolutely untouchable while vacationing safely across the globe. He was completely wrong. I was going to use his own massive digital footprint to systematically destroy him. His luxurious European fantasy would become his absolute worst living nightmare. Tomorrow arrived with a quiet knock on my heavy wooden hospital door. A young nurse walked in carrying a tray of warm food and a fresh cup of coffee. I thanked her politely and set the tray aside. My appetite had not returned, but my energy levels were significantly higher than the night before. I picked up my encrypted laptop and stared at the bright digital screen. The receipt for the $12,000 wedding dress was still etched into my mind. I needed to know exactly who was planning to wear it. I opened the master directory of Trevor's synchronized cloud storage and navigated away from the financial documents. I clicked on the massive folder containing his comprehensive photo backups. Trevor was incredibly vain and took pictures of absolutely everything he did. I sorted the images by location data, specifically isolating the files tagged in Europe over the past 48 hours. Hundreds of vibrant thumbnails populated my high-resolution monitor. I clicked on the very first image and felt my stomach drop instantly. It was a stunning photograph of a young woman standing on a beautiful balcony overlooking the water. I recognized her face immediately. Her name was Brittany. She was a junior marketing executive at Trevor's firm. We had actually hosted her at our home for a corporate dinner party exactly 2 years ago. I distinctly remembered pouring her a glass of red wine while she smiled right into my face. In the photograph on my screen, she was wearing a delicate white silk robe and holding a crystal glass of champagne. The digital geotag placed her directly at the exclusive Lake Como villa I had identified in his banking records. I clicked to the next photo in the large gallery. It was a romantic selfie of Trevor and Brittany. They were kissing passionately against the breathtaking backdrop of the Italian mountains. The caption he had saved on the image file read, "Simply forever begins today." My husband was not just having a casual physical affair. He had meticulously orchestrated an elaborate six-figure commitment ceremony halfway across the world. He was actively giving her the magical romantic wedding experience he had always claimed we could never afford. I continued scrolling rapidly through the digital albums. I found copies of their custom-embossed wedding invitations. I found dozens of photos detailing extravagant floral arrangements, catering menus, and elegant seating charts. He had spared absolutely no expense for his beautiful mistress, while simultaneously leaving his legal wife to freeze to death in the dark. But the absolute worst discovery was still waiting to be uncovered. I backed out of the extensive photo albums and opened a secondary application on his synced phone backup. It was a popular encrypted messaging application he frequently used to communicate with his family. Since I had cloned the entire device directly to my secure drive, I had full unrestricted access to his entire chat history. I opened an active group thread labeled simply as the European Wedding Squad. The participants included Trevor, his mother, Linda, his sister, Rachel, and Brittany. My hands shook violently as I began reading through months of their daily private conversations. They had all known every single detail. They had all been actively planning this grand betrayal together for well over a year. Linda had sent dozens of messages helping Brittany select the perfect floral arrangements and luxurious catering menus. Rachel had spent weeks enthusiastically coordinating the bridesmaid dresses and scheduling private boat tours for their time in Italy. They had openly discussed how to cleverly keep the entire elaborate event a secret from me. I read a sickening message from Rachel complaining about how annoying it was to pretend to like me during our weekly Sunday dinners. Linda had replied with a laughing emoji, telling her daughter to just be patient because Trevor was going to dump the dead weight soon. I scrolled down to the messages sent just 3 days ago on the exact morning they abandoned me. Trevor had texted the group chat directly from the busy airport terminal. I told them he had successfully taken my medication and locked the smart home hub. He bragged proudly about cutting the power and the water. Brittany had replied with a long string of heart emojis calling him her brilliant, brave protector. But it was Linda's message that truly made my blood run ice cold in my veins. She had typed a response saying it was about time someone put me in my place, and that a few days in the freezing cold would teach me a vital lesson in humility. She knew I had a severe, life-threatening lung infection. She knew I could not breathe properly. She had actively cheered on my suffering and praised her son for his absolute cruelty. I clicked on a recent photo attachment sent to the active group chat just yesterday afternoon. The high-resolution image loaded on my screen, and I felt a sharp physical pain in my chest. It was a picture of Linda, Rachel, and Brittany sitting together at a quaint outdoor cafe in Paris. They were all holding up crystal flutes of expensive champagne, smiling radiantly for the camera. The massive iron structure of the Eiffel Tower loomed beautifully in the background. But my eyes were entirely locked on Linda's smiling face. She was wearing a pair of stunning vintage diamond earrings. They were flawless, brilliant cut diamonds, beautifully set in delicate white gold. They were certainly not hers. They were mine. Those specific earrings had belonged to my late grandmother. They were the absolute most precious possession I owned, a family heirloom I cherished deeply. I kept them safely stored in a velvet box, hidden in the very back of my master closet. Linda had not just happily supported my husband's blatant infidelity and my attempted murder. She had actually gone into my private bedroom while I was violently sick and stolen my most cherished family heirloom to wear to her son's fake wedding. I stared blankly at the photograph of the three women toasting to their incredible European adventure. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked so completely free of any guilt or consequence. They were drinking expensive champagne and wearing stolen diamonds, while fully believing I was currently shivering to death in a dark house. I slowly closed the image file and let out a long breath. The last remaining shred of my mercy, the tiny quiet part of my heart that still wanted to believe my family could not be this evil, completely vanished. It was extinguished, entirely replaced by a solid, impenetrable wall of cold determination. I pushed the rolling hospital tray table away from my bed and carefully stood up. My legs were still slightly unsteady, but the burning rage inside me provided more than enough strength to keep me upright. I walked over to the large window and looked out over the clinic parking lot. The bright morning sun was shining clearly. My husband and his toxic family had profoundly miscalculated the entire situation. They actually thought my physical weakness equated to mental fragility and absolute compliance. They thought taking away my credit cards and locking my doors would somehow render me completely powerless against their unified cruelty. They failed to realize that they had just given me every single justification I needed to utterly destroy their lives. My mercy was completely gone forever. The revenge had officially begun today. The photograph of Linda, wearing my grandmother's earrings, remained open on the screen long after I had stopped looking at her face. I closed the group chat, created an encrypted evidence folder, and copied every photograph, message receipt, and metadata record into it. Then I opened a second secure workspace. Discovering the affair had answered why Trevor had fled to Europe, but it had not yet answered the more important question: what else did he believe he owned? For 4 years, Trevor had performed the role of provider with almost theatrical pride. On the first day of every month, he would sit at the kitchen island, open his banking application, and announce that he was paying $6,000 in rent. He always made sure I heard the number. If friends were visiting, he mentioned it twice. He described the property management company as ruthless and faceless, a corporate landlord that demanded punctual payment and charged severe penalties for any delay. Then he would turn to me and joke that my spreadsheet hobby could never keep a roof like this over our heads. I had allowed him to believe every word of that story because the truth had protected me. 3 years before our wedding, after completing a major forensic recovery for an international client, I had purchased the house for $1.5 million in cash. I bought it through a limited liability holding company created by my attorney to separate my personal residence from my professional assets. A second entity, my property management company, administered the lease collected payments, and handled maintenance records. Both companies legally belonged entirely to me. Trevor had never examined the ownership documents. He had seen a polished lease, a corporate logo, and an online payment portal, then assumed the man with the larger visible paycheck must be the one in control. Every $6,000 payment he proudly called proof of his sacrifice had moved from his account into mine. After taxes, insurance, and maintenance reserves, the remaining funds had been transferred automatically into my investment portfolio. Trevor had spent years financing the independence he believed I did not possess. I logged into the landlord portal using my encrypted administrator credentials. The dashboard displayed the property address, lease history, maintenance requests, and payment ledger. Green confirmation marks filled almost every month. Trevor had always paid on time because punctual rent supported the image he worshipped. Then I reached the current month. The payment line was red, returned for insufficient funds. I opened the transaction details. Trevor had initiated the $6,000 transfer 2 days before leaving, exactly as usual. The payment had entered processing, but his bank rejected it after the $50,000 Lake Como wire, and the cascade of European charges drained the account below the required balance. A second automatic attempt had failed that morning. Late fees were already accumulating under the terms of the lease he had signed without reading. For the first time since entering the clinic, I laughed. It was not loud or joyful. It was a quiet sound of recognition. Trevor had emptied his accounts to marry another woman, and in doing so had defaulted on the house he believed was his refuge. He had created the legal mechanism of his own removal. I downloaded the signed lease and reviewed every page. The agreement was straightforward. Rent was due on the 1st. A returned payment constituted non-payment. After the required statutory notice period, the landlord could terminate occupancy and seek possession of the property. The lease listed Trevor as the primary tenant. I appeared only as an approved occupant, because that was the arrangement I had chosen when we married. The house itself remained a premarital corporate asset, protected by records that existed years before Trevor entered my life. I opened the secure document vault, containing the original deed, closing statement, corporate registrations, tax filings, and proof of the cash purchase. The chain of ownership was clean. There was no mortgage, no contribution from Trevor, and no plausible argument that he had acquired equity through rent. He was not a co-owner. He was a tenant who had failed to pay. My weakness had vanished beneath a surge of precise professional focus. I created a new case file labeled Trevor Lease Termination and began assembling the evidence in chronological order. First came the deed and corporate ownership records. Next came the executed lease, the payment history, the return transaction, and the bank's insufficient funds notice. I added screenshots showing that the missed rent occurred after Trevor diverted marital funds to the Italian villa. Finally, I saved the messages proving he had intentionally locked me inside the property before abandoning it. The eviction had to be lawful. I would not imitate Trevor by acting recklessly and hoping intimidation could replace procedure. I checked the city's current notice requirements, downloaded the approved 14-day notice form, and completed every field carefully. The document identified my property management company as the landlord, Trevor as the defaulting tenant, the unpaid amount, the returned payment fee, and the deadline to cure the breach. If he failed to do so, his right to occupy the property would terminate. I did not send it yet. A notice involving my spouse, a corporate landlord, and an impending divorce needed to survive aggressive judicial scrutiny. I saved the completed draft for review by counsel and scheduled a secure call with Vincent Thorne, the most relentless litigator I knew. He would verify the filing procedure, arrange formal service, and make certain Trevor could not later claim ignorance or defective notice. Before closing the portal, I disabled Trevor's tenant access to non-essential administrative functions. He could no longer submit guest codes, authorize contractors, or alter contact information. I preserved his access only to the payment page and official notices exactly as required. Then I transferred control of every security and maintenance account back to the holding company. The screen changed immediately. Trevor's name disappeared from the property dashboard. Mine remained beside the words sole member and beneficial owner. For years, he had walked through my rooms as if I were a guest in the life he provided. He had criticized my decorating choices, restricted my use of his man cave, and reminded me that his rent supposedly purchased the final word in every household decision. Now the digital record displayed the truth without emotion or argument. The estate, the management company, and every dollar of accumulated equity belonged to me. I leaned back against the hospital pillows and studied the red returned payment notice one final time. Trevor thought he had left a sick, dependent wife behind while he escaped to build a new life. In reality, he had abandoned the owner of his home, defaulted on his lease, and handed her documented grounds to remove him before he returned. I also instructed the portal to preserve a complete audit log. Every login, payment attempt, administrative change, and automated notice was timestamped and exported into the evidence file. If Trevor tried to claim that I had invented the default after learning about Brittany, the system would prove otherwise. His own bank had rejected the payment before I ever opened the account. The record was independent, contemporaneous, and devastatingly clear. There would be no room for denial later. I saved the eviction package to my encrypted drive and closed the landlord portal. The house was secured on paper. Next, I needed to sever the financial lifeline funding his European fantasy. The first step in dismantling Trevor's meticulously crafted illusion was understanding how he planned to pay for the rest of it. I knew his personal savings were decimated by the $50,000 deposit for the Lake Como villa. He did not have the cash required to sustain a 27-day European tour for 3 women, let alone cover the vendor balances for an extravagant wedding ceremony. I leaned forward, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes, and initiated a deep sweep of my personal credit profile using a secure monitoring service. I had locked my credit files years ago as a security measure, but Trevor possessed the override personal identification numbers stored in his home office safe. If he was spending money he did not personally have, he was undoubtedly leveraging something else to maintain this facade. The loading bar crept across my screen, verifying my identity and pulling the most recent data from the 3 major credit bureaus. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. When the comprehensive credit report finally populated on my monitor, the glaring truth stared right back at me. Trevor had not just drained his own accounts to fund his betrayal. He had maliciously stolen my financial identity to finance his new life with Brittany. Buried under a list of my standard corporate credit cards and pristine financial history was a brand new joint line of credit. It had been quietly opened less than 3 weeks ago with a staggering limit of $100,000. I clicked on the account details, my eyes scanning the origination data. Trevor had used my social security number, my stellar credit rating, and my high corporate income to secure the massive loan. He had forged my digital signature on the application documents, listing himself as the primary authorized user with full spending privileges. My pulse quickened not with panic, but with an icy realization of his absolute stupidity. He had tethered his entire European fantasy to a financial lifeline that I exclusively owned and legally controlled. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the issuing bank's secure administrative portal. Using my social security number and primary contact information, I bypassed the initial security gates and initiated a password reset for the new account. Since the credit line was technically anchored to my primary identity, the bank automatically routed the authentication code to my burner phone, which was linked to my master profile. Within 60 seconds, I was inside the dashboard of the fraudulent account. The pending charges were staggering. Over the last 48 hours, Trevor had charged nearly $30,000 in international flights, luxury hotel deposits, and high-end dining. The remaining balance for the Lake Como wedding caterers, florists, and the final venue fee was scheduled to be automatically drafted from this exact credit line in less than 2 days. I picked up my burner phone and dialed the International Fraud Detection Hotline for the issuing bank. A polite professional customer service representative answered almost immediately. I kept my voice calm, steady, and devoid of any emotional distress. I identified myself using my full legal name and provided all the necessary security verification details. I informed the representative that I was currently hospitalized with a severe illness and had just discovered a massive line of credit fraudulently opened in my name. I explained that I was looking at dozens of exorbitant international charges originating in Paris, Milan, and Lake Como, and I could assure them with absolute certainty that I had not authorized a single one of those transactions. The representative gasped softly, immediately shifting into a heightened security protocol. She asked if I knew who might have compromised my identity. I told her I suspected my estranged husband had stolen my financial information before fleeing the country, but that I needed the account permanently frozen while I contacted my legal counsel and the authorities. The bank representative was incredibly efficient. She walked me through the mandatory fraud affidavit process, carefully reading the legal disclaimers over the phone. I verbally confirmed my understanding of the criminal investigation procedures, ensuring my actions were perfectly documented and legally ironclad. She immediately flagged every single international charge as highly suspicious and inherently fraudulent. With a few swift strokes on her keyboard, she completely locked the entire $100,000 credit line. She assured me that no further transactions would be approved under any circumstances, and the physical cards associated with the account were now entirely deactivated and useless. I thanked her graciously, disconnected the call, and set the phone down on my hospital bed. The trap had officially been sprung. Trevor was currently walking around Europe with a wallet full of worthless plastic. Freezing the fraudulent credit line was only the first phase of my financial retaliation. I would not leave a single penny accessible to him or his complicit family members. I navigated to the master list of our shared financial accounts. Trevor had always treated our joint checking and savings accounts as his personal piggy bank confidant. I was too busy with my consulting firm to micromanage the daily household ledgers. He had severely underestimated my meticulous nature. I opened the administrative settings for every shared account we possessed. I systematically changed the login passwords, replacing his predictable anniversary dates with complex randomized strings of alphanumeric code. I updated the security questions, changing the answers to highly specific details only I would ever know. The answers were obscure facts regarding my early childhood, things my self-absorbed husband never bothered to ask about during our entire marriage. He would never guess his way back inside. I removed his recovery email addresses and deleted his cell phone number from the multi-factor authentication protocols. I completely severed his digital access to every single dollar we had ever saved. I then moved to his secondary credit cards, the ones he generously handed out to his mother and sister for their luxurious Parisian shopping sprees. Since those cards were ultimately linked to my primary corporate accounts, I retained the authority to manage them. I navigated to the card management dashboard and selected Linda's authorized user profile. I clicked the bright red button labeled Report Lost or Stolen and deactivated the card. I repeated the exact process for Rachel's card. In under 20 minutes, I had orchestrated a total financial blackout. My husband, his mother, and his sister were currently thousands of miles away from home, indulging in an expensive lifestyle they could no longer afford. They were stranded in the most expensive cities in the world, with absolutely no access to cash, no functioning credit cards, and a massive unpaid wedding bill looming over their heads. I leaned back against the plush hospital pillows and took a slow, deep breath. The severe tightness in my chest was finally beginning to ease, replaced by a profound and deep sense of satisfaction. I closed my laptop and rested my hands on my lap. Trevor thought he held all the power because he controlled the front door of our house. He had no idea that I controlled the very foundation of his entire reality. The countdown had officially started. It was only a matter of time before he attempted to pay for a luxurious dinner or lavish spa treatment, only to find his cards publicly declined. The spectacular collapse of his perfect European wedding was imminent, and I was going to enjoy watching every second of his inevitable downfall unfold completely before my eyes. The first sign of panic arrived less than an hour after I completed the financial blackout. My primary phone vibrated repeatedly across the hospital tray. Trevor's name filled the screen, followed by 3 missed calls, then 7, then 12. I let every call ring until it stopped. A moment later, the messages began. "What did you do to the cards? Call the bank immediately. They flagged the European charges. Fix it now." His tone was not frightened yet. It was irritated, commanding, and entirely certain that I would obey. He still believed I was lying helpless beneath the blankets in our dark house, grateful for any scrap of attention he gave me. I placed the phone beside my coffee and watched the notifications accumulate. Across the Atlantic, Linda and Rachel had discovered the problem before Trevor did. They were standing inside an exclusive Milan boutique surrounded by polished marble mirrored walls and handbags displayed beneath museum lighting. The boutique's loss prevention director, Sophia Moretti, had worked with my firm during a luxury goods fraud investigation the previous year. When two cards connected to my corporate account triggered stolen card alerts, the internal system automatically attached my security contact information. Sophia sent me a discreet message asking whether the attempted purchases were authorized. They were not. I confirmed the fraud report and asked her to preserve the transaction records and surveillance footage. She replied that the women at the counter were becoming aggressive. With my written authorization as the account holder, she opened a secure video link from the loss prevention office so I could identify the users for the incident report. The camera showed Linda standing at the register beneath a chandelier, dressed in an expensive cream coat and wearing my grandmother's diamond earrings. 3 handbags and several silk scarves were arranged on the counter. Rachel stood beside her holding a pair of oversized sunglasses, while a sales associate waited with the rigid patience of someone trained to remain polite around wealthy customers. Linda pushed a platinum card across the marble counter. The associate inserted it into the terminal. A red message appeared. Declined card reported stolen. Linda's face tightened. She demanded that the associate run it again. The second attempt produced the same result. Rachel rolled her eyes, pulled out her own card, and announced loudly that her mother's bank was incompetent. Her transaction failed before she finished the sentence. The associate quietly asked them for another method of payment. Linda's voice rose immediately. She insisted that Trevor was a prominent executive and that the boutique would regret humiliating his family. Rachel accused the employee of entering the numbers incorrectly, then demanded the manager. Other shoppers turned to watch. One woman slowly raised her phone and began recording. I sat in my warm recovery suite, wrapped in a robe, and took a sip of tea while Linda's performance disintegrated. She slapped the marble counter and threatened to call the police. Sophia stepped onto the sales floor accompanied by security and informed them that the cards had been formally reported as compromised. The merchandise was removed from the counter. Linda clutched at the earrings as if their diamonds could restore her status. Rachel shouted that they were guests of a Lake Como wedding party and had more money than anyone in the store. Security escorted them through the boutique, while the other customers watched in delighted silence. At the entrance, Rachel attempted to snatch one of the scarves from the associate's hands. A guard blocked her, and the scarf fell onto the polished floor. The entire scene lasted less than 6 minutes. By the time they were deposited on the sidewalk, several bystanders had captured enough footage to ensure their humiliation would not remain private. Sophia ended the secure link and sent me the incident report. I thanked her, requested certified copies of the declined transactions, and added everything to my evidence archive. The stolen card designation was accurate. Those cards belonged to my corporate accounts, and Linda and Rachel had no permission to use them after I revoked their authorization. Trevor's next call came from Lake Como. This time he left a voice message. His controlled irritation had become naked panic. He said the venue had attempted to process the final catering and floral deposit, but every card in his wallet had failed. He claimed the bank required confirmation from me because the accounts were connected to my profile. He ordered me to call immediately, authorize the charges, and stop creating problems during an important family event. Important family event. He still refused to say wedding. He still imagined the lie mattered. Another message appeared. Amber, answer me. The villa is giving us 48 hours. If you do not fix this, you will destroy everything. I read the sentence twice. He had stolen my medication, shut down the essential systems in my home, locked me inside, and flown away to marry his mistress. Yet in Trevor's version of reality, I would be the one destroying everything if I refused to finance it. I finally typed a reply. Oh no, my fever is still so high I can barely see my phone screen to call the bank. Just use the credit cards you took from my purse. I added no accusation and no threat. I sent the message and watched the delivery confirmation appear. His response arrived almost instantly. This is not funny. Then you have no idea what you are doing. Then when I get home, we are going to have a serious conversation about your behavior. I saved screenshots of every message. His words were more than satisfying. They documented that he knew I was ill, expected me to solve the financial crisis he created, and believed he retained the authority to punish me after returning. I forwarded the thread to my encrypted legal folder. The venue manager attempted the scheduled charge again that afternoon. It failed. Rather than cancel the reservation immediately, the villa issued a 48-hour cure notice. The caterers suspended preparation. The florist placed the imported arrangements on hold. The boat company released its reservation to another client. Each vendor copied Trevor on urgent emails demanding verified funds. He tried every avenue available to him. He called the bank and failed the identity verification questions I had changed. He attempted to reset the passwords, but the authentication codes came to my burner phone. He used Linda's and Rachel's accounts only to discover that their cards were disabled. He even attempted a cash advance, but the machine retained one of the reported cards. By evening, his messages changed from commands to bargaining. He promised to explain everything when he returned. He claimed Brittany was merely helping coordinate a corporate event. He said Linda had accidentally packed my earrings. He insisted the medication had been moved for my safety. Every lie contradicted the evidence already stored on my drive. I did not respond again. Instead, I documented the venue deadline, the failed payment attempts, the Milan incident, and Trevor's coercive messages. The financial trap was working exactly as intended, but freezing the accounts would not be enough. He could still return home attempt to force his way back inside and use the marriage itself as a shield. I closed the message thread and opened my secure contact list. The next phase required formal legal authority control of my property and an attorney who understood how to turn documentary evidence into an irreversible judgment. I selected Vincent Thorne's name and requested an emergency consultation. I did not have to wait long to put the next phase of my plan into motion. By mid-morning, my primary physician cleared me for discharge. My fever had completely broken, and my lungs were clear enough to manage with oral antibiotics and a standard inhaler. I arranged for a private car service to take me to a secure extended-stay hotel downtown. I needed a sterile, quiet environment with high-speed internet to initiate the legal destruction of my husband. Once settled in my suite, I opened my laptop and initiated a secure video call. I was not going to hire a standard attorney who would push for an amicable mediation. I needed a ruthless litigator. I called Vincent Thorne. He was the senior partner at one of the most aggressive corporate law firms in the city, and a man I had worked with extensively during high-stakes financial embezzlement investigations. Vincent was famously cold, calculating, and relentless in a courtroom. When his face appeared on my screen, I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his services for a matter involving financial fraud and intentional endangerment. I shared my screen and walked him through the digital paper trail I had uncovered overnight. I showed him the forged credit applications, the drained joint accounts, the $50,000 wire transfer, and the $12,000 wedding dress receipt. Vincent remained perfectly silent as I presented the evidence. His eyes tracked across the documents with sharp, predatory focus. When I showed him the text messages from Trevor, bragging about hiding my medication and cutting the power to our home, Vincent simply leaned back. He told me he had seen many bitter divorces, but the sheer malicious stupidity of my husband was entirely unprecedented. He agreed to take my case immediately. I told him we were going to hit Trevor and his complicit family members with a synchronized legal strike so overwhelming that they would never be able to recover. Our very first order of business was securing my physical property. During the call, I transmitted the deed, LLC records signed, lease returned payment notice, and draft 14-day notice I had prepared at the clinic. Vincent reviewed the chain of title and confirmed that the house was my premarital corporate asset, and that Trevor's failed payment created a valid basis for termination under the lease. His staff converted my draft into the city-approved form, arranged formal service through the tenant portal and certified mail, and filed the notice with the housing authority. By the time Trevor returned, the cure period would have expired, and his right to occupy the property would be terminated. With the house officially secured, we moved seamlessly into drafting the divorce petition. I was not going to file a standard no-fault dissolution of marriage. I instructed Vincent to file the petition explicitly citing severe financial fraud and blatant infidelity. We attached the extensive photographic evidence of Trevor and Brittany kissing on the balcony of the Lake Como villa, along with the copies of their wedding. We also included the detailed logs of the fraudulent $100,000 credit line he had opened using my pristine Social Security number. Vincent assured me that given the overwhelming amount of documentary evidence we possessed, any family court judge would immediately freeze all remaining shared assets and grant me exclusive control over my personal finances pending a full criminal investigation. Trevor was going to return to America to find himself not just divorced, but entirely stripped of any marital support. However, simply divorcing him and kicking him out of the house was not nearly enough. Trevor, his mother Linda, and his sister Rachel had actively conspired to leave me to die. They had laughed about my severe illness and stolen my precious family heirlooms. They needed to face devastating consequences that went far beyond a standard marital separation. I directed Vincent to prepare a massive, comprehensive civil lawsuit naming all three of them as active co-defendants. The civil suit was a masterpiece of legal retaliation. We meticulously outlined the theft of my prescribed antibiotics and my emergency rescue inhaler, classifying it as reckless endangerment and intentional infliction of severe emotional and physical distress. We documented the deliberate shutdown of the home's essential systems, proving that Trevor had intentionally deactivated the power and water to our home during a freezing cold snap, while fully aware of my critical medical condition. We included the medical reports from the Oakwood Medical Concierge, detailing my dangerously high fever and compromised respiratory state. The clinic administrators provided sworn affidavits regarding my physical condition upon arrival, corroborating my timeline of events. We did not stop at the physical endangerment. The civil suit also aggressively targeted the financial crimes. We sued Trevor for the $50,000 he had brazenly embezzled from our joint checking and savings accounts to fund his fake wedding ceremony. We added the value of the $12,000 designer wedding gown and the thousands of dollars Linda and Rachel had spent on luxury leather goods and cosmetics in Paris. I also made sure Vincent included a specific demand for the immediate return of my grandmother vintage diamond earrings, which Linda was wearing in her social media photographs. We calculated the total damages, seeking full restitution for the stolen funds, the medical expenses I incurred at the private clinic, and punitive damages for their coordinated malicious actions. Vincent worked late into the evening, finalizing the dense legal filings. We spent hours reviewing every single paragraph, ensuring there were no loopholes or technical errors that Trevor could possibly exploit. I wanted the legal paperwork to be an impenetrable fortress. By the time we finished, the sun had completely set over the city skyline outside my hotel window. Vincent promised that his clerks would have everything officially filed with the respective courts first thing the following morning. He told me to get some rest and focus on recovering my physical strength, because the legal foundation for their destruction was now perfectly set in stone. I disconnected the secure video call and closed my encrypted laptop. I walked over to the large window of my hotel suite and looked at the glowing city lights. My lungs felt slightly bruised when I took a deep breath, but the crushing panic had completely vanished. I had spent my entire marriage blindly believing I was building a reliable partnership with a man who genuinely respected me. Instead, I had secretly funded the entitled lifestyle of a monster and his greedy enablers. But the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted today. I had utilized the very legal and financial systems they thought they could easily manipulate to build an inescapable trap. They were currently sleeping in their European resort rooms, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had vanished. I had severed their access to my wealth, stripped them of their home, and initiated legal actions that would ruin them financially and socially for the rest of their lives. The paperwork was filed and the trap was armed. Now I just needed to prepare the empty house for their ultimate return. I woke up the next morning feeling a renewed sense of physical strength that completely mirrored my mental clarity. The powerful antibiotics were finally doing their job, and my fever was nothing more than a distant memory. I checked out of the extended stay hotel and arranged for a private car to take me back to my neighborhood. Pulling into the wide driveway of my own home felt entirely different than it had just a few days ago when I was loaded into the back of an ambulance. The large house stood exactly as I had left it, but it no longer felt like a shared marital space or a cold prison. It was simply a highly valuable piece of corporate real estate that I legally owned, and it was desperately in need of a thorough cleaning. I unlocked the front door, using my newly encrypted master code, and stepped inside. The air was slightly stale, but the central heating system I had restored was working perfectly. I walked through the quiet hallways, taking a careful, meticulous inventory of every single item that belonged to my husband and his complicit family members. There was exactly 15 days left until their scheduled return flight to America. That was more than enough time to completely eradicate their physical presence from my property. I was certainly not going to spend my valuable time or my recovering energy personally packing their belongings into neat little cardboard boxes. I wanted this process to be as swift and ruthless as the massive legal strike Vincent had just filed on my behalf. I contacted a commercial junk removal and moving service that my property management company occasionally used for rapid corporate evictions. I requested a premium expedited service, paying a substantial upfront premium to have a 5-person crew arrive at my house within the hour. I specifically instructed the dispatcher not to bring any delicate packing materials or protective bubble wrap. I told them to bring dozens of heavy-duty industrial garbage bags and the largest moving truck they had available. When the crew arrived, I met the foreman in the driveway. I was a tall, no-nonsense man who clearly understood the aggressive nature of sudden domestic evictions. I handed him a detailed room-by-room manifest I had typed up that morning. I explicitly authorized him to clear out the master bedroom closet, the guest rooms where my in-laws stored their seasonal wardrobes, and the entire garage. I gave him one very simple instruction. If the item belonged to a man, or if it belonged to an older woman, it was going to be bagged and removed immediately. I stood in the doorway of the master bedroom and watched with profound satisfaction as the crew went to work. It was an incredibly cathartic experience to witness the systematic dismantling of Trevor's entitled lifestyle. The workers grabbed his expensive tailored suits, his imported silk ties, and his Italian leather shoes, sweeping them off the hangers and shoving them unceremoniously into the thick black plastic bags. They emptied his heavy oak dresser drawers, tossing his luxury watches, his expensive colognes, and his extensive collection of designer sunglasses in right alongside his dirty gym clothes. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation as the expensive fabrics he valued so highly were crushed and tangled together in the dark plastic. I walked down the hall to the 2 large guest suites. Linda and Rachel had basically treated my home as their own personal overflow storage facility for years. They frequently left their bulky winter coats, their extensive collections of evening gowns, and dozens of pairs of designer shoes in my closets to free up space in their own cramped apartments. I watched the crew yank Linda's expensive fur coats and Rachel's designer cocktail dresses from the racks, tossing them into the garbage bags with zero hesitation. The crew then moved out to the garage. They hauled out Trevor's custom-fitted golf clubs, his expensive mountain bike, and his massive collection of high-end power tools. Every single piece of equipment he had purchased using my income was carried out to the waiting truck. The sheer volume of material goods they had accumulated while secretly plotting to destroy me was absolutely sickening. It took the efficient moving crew less than 4 hours to completely strip the house of their existence. When they carried the very last heavy black garbage bag out the front door, my home immediately felt infinitely lighter. I followed the large moving truck in my own vehicle, driving far away from the pristine, manicured streets of our upscale suburb. I guided them to a very dark, dilapidated industrial park on the very edge of the city limits. I had rented a large ground-level storage unit at the cheapest, most run-down facility I could possibly find. It was a massive corrugated metal box, situated right next to a busy, noisy highway intersection. There was absolutely no climate control, no sophisticated security cameras, and no on-site management staff to monitor the premises. It was basically a large baking oven in the summer and a freezing tin can in the winter. The foreman backed the moving truck up to the rolling metal door. I unlocked the cheap padlock and stood back as the crew began unloading the mountain of black garbage bags. They tossed the heavy bags into the dusty concrete space, stacking them haphazardly from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. Trevor's expensive golf clubs were shoved into a dirty corner right next to the trash bags containing his mother's luxury furs. The visual contrast between their current five-star European vacation and the squalid final resting place of their worldly possessions was poetic justice. I walked into the dusty rental office and paid the property manager in cash for exactly 1 month of rent. I did not leave a forwarding address or a credit card on file for automatic renewal. If Trevor did not somehow manage to empty the storage unit, within 30 days, the facility would simply auction off his entire life to the highest bidder. I drove back to my house in a state of comfortable, peaceful silence. When I walked through the heavy front door, the echoing emptiness of the space greeted me like a warm embrace. The large walk-in closets were entirely bare. The massive garage was cavernous and clean. The lavish guest rooms where my in-laws used to stay and constantly criticize my hospitality were completely stripped down to the bare walls and the neutral carpet. There was not a single framed photograph, a stray sock, or a lingering scent of any of them left in the entire building. It was exactly as if they had never existed in my life at all. I walked into the pristine kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of refreshing ice-cold sparkling water. The physical purge was completely finished, but the total transformation of the property was only just beginning. I pulled out my mobile phone and dialed the direct number for a high-end commercial contracting firm I frequently used for my corporate office build-outs. I had precisely 14 days to turn this empty residential shell into a fortified professional sanctuary. Trevor was going to come back to America, expecting to walk into a comfortable, welcoming luxury home. Instead, he was going to find an impenetrable fortress he could not breach. The commercial contracting crew arrived precisely at 8 sharp on Monday morning. I stood on the front porch with a steaming cup of black coffee and greeted the foreman, a burly man named Marcus, who had overseen the build-out of my downtown corporate office 3 years ago. I walked him through the empty, echoing house and explained the massive scope of the project. We had exactly 14 days to completely reimagine the property from top to bottom. Money was absolutely no object, and I authorized an enormous premium for round-the-clock labor. Marcus understood the urgency and immediately dispatched his large crew to begin the aggressive demolition phase. We started at the back of the ground floor in the large room Trevor had obnoxiously designated as his ultimate man cave. For the entirety of our marriage, he had strictly forbidden me from entering this space. He claimed a hard-working provider needed a private sanctuary to decompress from the immense pressures of paying the monthly rent. The sheer audacity of that lie burned in my mind as I instructed the workers to tear down absolutely everything. They took heavy sledgehammers to the ugly dark wood paneling he had proudly installed. They ripped up the thick shag carpet that constantly smelled of stale beer and cheap cigars. They dismantled the massive custom-built wet bar where he used to entertain his equally entitled friends. I stood in the bright hallway watching the dust billow out, feeling a profound wave of liberation. Once the room was completely stripped down to the bare studs and the concrete foundation, the real transformation began. I directed the electrical team to run new high-capacity wiring to support the sophisticated servers and dual-monitor workstations required for my expanding forensic accounting firm. This room was no longer a monument to Trevor's inflated ego. It was officially going to become the operational heart of my independent wealth. The drywall crew worked flawlessly, putting up fresh panels and coating them in a pristine, crisp, brilliant white paint that instantly made the room feel twice as large. We laid down sleek, soundproof luxury vinyl flooring in a modern, cool gray tone to replace the offensive carpeting. 2 days later, my expensive custom furniture arrived. I had ordered a massive frosted glass executive desk that commanded the center of the room. Behind it, the crew installed floor-to-ceiling minimalist shelving units to hold my extensive legal and financial reference libraries. I had them mount a massive flat-screen display on the far wall for analyzing complex spreadsheets and video conferencing with my high-net-worth corporate clients. I carefully arranged my diplomas and professional certifications on the walls, proudly displaying the very credentials my husband had always tried to minimize. When the cleaning crew polished the glass desk and vacuumed the new floors, I stood in the doorway and smiled. Trevor's pathetic man cave had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a stunning state-of-the-art corporate command center. With my brand new office fully operational, I shifted my focus to the exterior security of the property. I absolutely refused to let Trevor simply walk up to the front door and demand entry when he eventually returned from his luxurious European vacation. I contacted a premier commercial security firm that specialized in high-risk corporate properties. They dispatched a team of technicians who worked tirelessly to upgrade every single vulnerability in the house. We started by completely replacing all the exterior doors with reinforced steel core doors that looked identical to luxury wood but could withstand a tremendous amount of blunt force. The weak standard deadbolts were swapped out for advanced biometric locks that required my specific fingerprint and a rotating digital keypad code to open. I had them install shatterproof security film on every single window on the ground floor, ensuring no one could easily break the glass to gain access. The most significant upgrade was the perimeter. I hired a specialized landscaping and fencing crew to install heavy-duty wrought iron privacy gates across the wide driveway. The gates were 8 feet tall, featuring sharp decorative spikes along the top, and were operated by an encrypted electronic mechanism. They completely blocked any vehicle from entering the property without my explicit digital authorization. Finally, the professional security team mounted high-definition, night vision surveillance cameras at every possible angle around the exterior. The entire comprehensive system fed directly to a secure application on my brand-new burner phone. With the physical perimeter of the property fully secured, I turned my attention to the remaining interior spaces. For years, I had quietly tolerated the horrific design choices forced upon me by Linda and Rachel. They had stubbornly insisted on painting the main living areas a sickly pale yellow and filled all our shared spaces with clunky, outdated floral furniture. I quickly hired a highly specialized interior design team to completely erase their terrible influence overnight. A crew of professional painters worked through the weekend, covering every yellow wall with sophisticated calming shades of charcoal and stark clean white. Their old furniture was immediately donated to a local charity center without a second thought. In its place, the designers brought in sleek modern leather sectionals, elegant glass coffee tables, and contemporary artwork that perfectly reflected my personal taste. I walked through the massive chef's kitchen, pausing to admire the newly installed quartz countertops and the gleaming stainless steel appliances. Trevor had always claimed the kitchen was his domain because he liked to barbecue on the weekends, leaving a greasy mess for me to clean up every single time. Now it was breathtakingly pristine, sterile, and entirely mine. The guest bedrooms, once overflowing with their ridiculous seasonal wardrobes, were transformed into beautiful minimalist workout spaces and reading rooms. I hired professional organizers to deep clean the remaining cabinets and completely sanitize the ventilation system. I wanted to eliminate even the lingering microscopic dust particles of the people who had abandoned me. On the final day, exactly one full day, before my deceitful husband and his family were scheduled to return to the United States, the specialized contractors officially completed their work and departed. The lingering smell of fresh paint and expensive cleaning supplies filled the air entirely, replacing the familiar scents of Trevor's cologne and Linda's overpowering perfume. There was absolutely no trace that my husband or his greedy family had ever lived inside these walls. The fundamental architectural layout was exactly the same, but the spirit of the house had been completely rewritten. It was no longer a monument to his financial dominance, but a flawless reflection of my own spectacular resilience. I walked into the master bathroom and stood before the large vanity mirror. I looked healthy, strong, and completely devoid of the suffocating anxiety that had constantly plagued me for the last 4 years. I slowly pulled out my encrypted mobile phone and checked the secure connection to my new exterior security cameras. The high-definition feed showed the impenetrable wrought iron gates firmly locked, standing as a silent sentinel against the impending storm. The trap was perfectly set. The legal documents were securely filed. The financial blackout was absolute. He would realize the immense magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. Trevor was going to land at the airport tomorrow, expecting to smoothly resume his comfortable life. Instead, he would arrive at a fortified compound to discover that he had permanently lost the only woman he ever truly underestimated. 48 hours after the villa issued its cure notice, the deadline expired without a single successful payment. Trevor had spent 2 days calling banks, vendors, relatives, and former friends, but every path to emergency money ended in refusal. The venue manager met him in the marble lobby with a printed termination letter and a security officer standing nearby. Because the remaining balance had not cleared, the reservation was cancelled under the contract. The caterers withdrew their staff, the florist redirected the white roses to another event, and the boat company released the private cruise. Employees entered the suites to begin removing decorations, while Trevor argued that the funds were only temporarily delayed. The manager remained unmoved. He gave Trevor, Linda, Rachel, and Brittany 1 hour to collect their luggage and vacate the estate. Outside, delivery vans rolled away one by one, carrying the food, flowers, and equipment meant for the ceremony. The fantasy did not collapse in a dramatic explosion. It disappeared through a series of locked doors, cancelled invoices, and workers who no longer had any reason to pretend Trevor was wealthy. Trevor sprinted up the grand staircase to the master bridal suite, expecting to find comfort from his beautiful bride-to-be. Brittany was sitting at the ornate vanity mirror, applying expensive cosmetics she had purchased using my money. Trevor blurted out the catastrophic news, pacing the room and pulling at his hair. He told her the bank had made a massive error and all their accounts were completely locked. He asked her to use her personal savings to cover the final deposit, just until he could get the bank on the phone and sort everything out. Brittany stopped applying her makeup and slowly turned around. Her expression shifted from mild annoyance to cold realization. She asked him exactly how much money was currently in his personal checking account. Trevor hesitated before admitting he had drained his own funds to pay the initial villa deposit and was relying entirely on my corporate credit lines to fund the rest of the trip. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face. She realized in that exact moment that the wealthy, successful man she thought she was marrying was completely broke. He was nothing more than a parasite feeding off his sick wife. Disgust curled her upper lip. She stood up and silently walked over to the massive walk-in closet. She pulled down her designer luggage and began throwing her expensive clothes inside. Trevor begged her to stop, promising he would fix it, and pleading with her not to let a stupid banking error ruin their special day. Brittany ignored his desperate pleas. She zipped her suitcase shut and walked over to his jacket resting on the bed. She reached into his inside pocket and pulled out his wallet. She removed every single euro note and American dollar he had stashed inside, shoving the cash into her purse. She looked him dead in the eyes and told him he was a pathetic liar. She walked out of the bridal suite, leaving Trevor entirely alone in the echoing silence of the empty room. The reality of their situation crashed down on them as they stood on the cobblestone driveway outside the locked villa with their luggage piled around their feet. They had absolutely no money, no access to credit, and nowhere to sleep. Trevor managed to use the last remaining percentage of his cell phone battery to search for the absolute cheapest lodging available in the area. The luxurious 5-star European vacation immediately downgraded into a desperate struggle for basic survival. They dragged their heavy designer suitcases through the steep, narrow streets for nearly 2 miles. They finally arrived at a dilapidated youth hostel situated above a noisy, busy tavern. The building smelled of stale beer and cheap cleaning supplies. Trevor paid for a single cramped room using the loose change he found buried at the bottom of his backpack. The room featured 2 rusted metal bunk beds and a single dirty window overlooking a dark alleyway. Linda sat on the thin mattress and openly wept, mourning the loss of her luxurious lifestyle. Rachel complained loudly about the lack of air conditioning and the questionable stains on the walls. Trevor sat on the floor, resting his head in his hands, utterly defeated. Over the next several days, their situation grew even more dire. They survived entirely on cheap street food, splitting single portions of stale bread and greasy pizza because they could not afford proper meals. The rich, extravagant dinners they had bragged about on social media were replaced by agonizing hunger and constant bitter arguments. Linda and Rachel blamed Trevor for the entire disaster, completely turning on him when the luxury evaporated. The tension in the tiny hostel room was suffocating. Trevor finally swallowed his massive pride and began reaching out to extended family members back in the United States. He sent desperate, humiliating messages to his uncles, his cousins, and even old college friends, begging for a temporary loan. He fabricated wild stories about being robbed by pickpockets in Milan, but his panicked tone betrayed the desperate truth. He needed thousands of dollars just to purchase 3 budget economy airline tickets to get his miserable family back home. Every single day that passed in that squalid hostel chipped away at his arrogant ego. I was forced to endure the absolute humiliation of begging for scraps while trapped in a foreign country. He thought he could easily discard me and enjoy the fruits of my labor. Instead, he was currently living a nightmare entirely of his own making. I watched the digital footprint of his destruction from the comfort of my secure fortress, back in our quiet city. Every time a confused relative called me asking about Trevor and his sudden request for emergency funds, I simply explained that he had chosen to empty our joint savings to fund a secret, lavish wedding ceremony with his young mistress. I sent them the photographic evidence of his betrayal and clearly outlined the financial fraud he had committed against my personal credit. One by one, the doors of family support slammed firmly shut in his face. There would be no sudden rescue and no sympathetic bailouts waiting for him. He was utterly ruined and stranded. The magnificent house of cards he had so carefully built upon my trusting foundation had finally collapsed, leaving him buried beneath the heavy rubble of his greed. The absolute endgame was here. It was precisely day 27 of their European expedition when the final act of my purge played out on my high-definition security monitors. I sat comfortably behind the frosted glass desk in my newly remodeled home office. The room was climate-controlled and a steaming cup of artisan coffee rested on a coaster to my right. I had the primary surveillance feed displayed on the flat-screen monitor, offering me a pristine view of the front perimeter. I knew their exact itinerary, because I had been tracking the budget flight they booked using loans begged from alienated family. The flight landed at the international terminal 3 hours ago, and I knew it would take time to navigate customs and secure the cheapest ground transportation available. Right on schedule, a battered yellow taxi with a dented front bumper slowly turned onto my manicured street. The vehicle stood out like a sore thumb in the upscale neighborhood, its noisy exhaust sputtering as it crawled toward my address. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, folded my hands together, and watched the feed with absolute satisfaction. The taxi jerked to a halt directly in front of the imposing heavy-duty wrought iron privacy gates I had installed across the driveway. For a few long moments, nothing happened. I could easily imagine the frantic scramble occurring inside the cramped vehicle as they pooled together their last crumpled dollar bills to pay the frustrated driver. Finally, the rear doors of the taxi swung open, and the trio emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight. The sight of them was absolutely glorious. They were exhausted, physically depleted, and visibly broken. Trevor, who had left the country looking like an arrogant golden boy in a tailored suit, now looked haggard and utterly defeated. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, hanging loosely on his frame after weeks of surviving on cheap street food and sharing squalid hostel rooms. Linda and Rachel slid out of the vehicle looking even worse. Their once immaculate hair was flat and greasy, and they were wearing mismatched, unwashed sweatpants and oversized t-shirts. Even through the digital screen, I could almost smell the distinct pungent odor of cheap hostels and desperate, unwashed fury clinging to them. The taxi driver did not even bother getting out of the car to assist them. He simply popped the trunk, forcing Trevor to drag their heavy, scuffed designer suitcases out onto the hard concrete curb himself. The expensive leather luggage they had proudly paraded around Milan was now covered in dark scuff marks and dirt, a perfect physical metaphor for their ruined luxury lifestyle. As the taxi sped away, leaving a cloud of gray exhaust in its wake, Trevor stood on the sidewalk and finally looked up at the house. I zoomed the camera in on his face, watching his expression shift from sheer exhaustion to profound, absolute confusion. He stared at the 8-foot-tall wrought iron gates, his bloodshot eyes tracing the sharp decorative spikes along the top. He had expected to walk right up to the familiar wooden front door punch in his code and immediately collapse onto his comfortable leather sofa. Instead, he was facing an impenetrable, heavily fortified barricade that had completely transformed the welcoming suburban property into a secure corporate compound. I watched him turn and say something to his mother and sister. Linda was holding a hand up to shield her eyes from the sun, her face contorted in a mask of bitter, profound misery. Rachel was slumped over her luggage, complaining endlessly. Trevor squared his shoulders, attempting to summon the arrogant, entitled dominance he had relied on for our entire marriage. He marched aggressively up to the newly installed stone pillar housing the advanced biometric security keypad. He did not hesitate. He raised his hand and forcefully jabbed his old familiar 4-digit entry code into the glowing digital interface, fully expecting the heavy metal gates to smoothly swing open and grant him the sanctuary he felt he fundamentally deserved. Nothing happened. The screen simply blinked with a harsh, bright red error light. I zoomed in closer, watching the veins in his neck bulge as his frustration instantly boiled over into genuine, unfiltered rage. He muttered a string of angry curses and hammered his thumb against the keypad again, punching the numbers with violent, aggressive force. He tried his code, then he tried his mother's old code, and finally he tried the master override code I used to let the housekeepers inside. Every single attempt was met with the same cold, unforgiving red light of absolute rejection. He was locked out, and the reality of his complete loss of control was finally beginning to penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. He stepped back from the keypad, his chest heaving with exertion and fury, and balled his hands into tight, white-knuckled fists. He raised his arm and struck the heavy metal gate with the side of his fist, a futile, pathetic display of physical aggression. That was precisely the trigger I had been waiting for. I reached over to my desk, picked up my encrypted mobile phone, and tapped the specific icon on my security application. Instantly, a massive, deafening, high-decibel security siren erupted from the concealed speakers mounted along the property line. The piercing, oscillating shriek was incredibly loud, designed to disorient and overwhelm any potential intruders. On the monitor, the physical reaction was immediate and highly entertaining. Linda shrieked and dropped her heavy purse, clamping both of her hands tightly over her ears as she stumbled backward onto the grass. Rachel practically tripped over her own scuffed designer suitcase, her face twisted in a mask of absolute profound panic. Trevor stumbled away from the gate, looking wildly around the property as the relentless, ear-splitting siren continued to wail across the quiet upscale neighborhood. The sheer volume of the alarm was already causing the neighbors to peek out from behind their drawn living room curtains, drawing the exact kind of public attention and deep social humiliation my status-obsessed mother-in-law absolutely despised. Before Trevor could shout over the noise, the heavy steel front door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped onto the porch, dressed in a crisp black tactical uniform. This was not a friendly neighborhood watch volunteer or a casual neighborhood security guard. This was Marcus, one of the highly trained private security specialists I had hired for this exact specific moment. He was armed, visually imposing, and carried himself with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man who dealt exclusively with high-risk corporate evictions and hostile trespassers. I pressed a button on my desk console to deactivate the blaring siren, allowing the sudden echoing silence to amplify the incredible tension of the moment. Marcus walked down the front pathway with slow, deliberate, measured steps, stopping just a few feet on the other side of the wrought iron gate. He stood with his hands resting easily on his tactical belt, looking down at Trevor with cold professional detachment. Trevor immediately lunged toward the metal bars, his face red with manic, exhausted fury. He began screaming at the guard, pointing his finger aggressively through the iron gaps, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing inside his house. He shouted that he was the legal resident, that he paid the rent, and that he was going to call the police and have Marcus arrested for breaking and entering. Marcus did not even flinch once. Marcus did not even flinch once. He did not reach for his weapon, nor did he raise his voice to match my husband's frantic, aggressive, spit-flying tirade. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of highly trained muscle, and stared at Trevor as if he were a particularly annoying buzzing insect that had briefly interrupted his day. The absolute lack of response only infuriated Trevor further. He violently shook the heavy iron bars, his knuckles turning stark white, demanding to speak to whoever was in charge of the property. Linda, finally recovering from the shock of the high-decibel siren, scrambled up from the grass and marched toward the gate to support her son. She gripped the bars next to Trevor, her face twisted into a mask of arrogant suburban indignation. She shrilly yelled at Marcus that he was making a terrible mistake. She boldly claimed that her daughter-in-law, Amber, was clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown inside the house. She insisted that I was severely ill, completely unstable, and obviously not in my right mind when I hired him. She demanded that Marcus immediately step aside and open the gates so they could get inside and take control of the unfortunate medical situation. Rachel stood a few feet behind them, shivering in her dirty sweatpants, complaining loudly that her feet hurt and whining that she just wanted to take a hot shower. I watched the entire pathetic display from the high-definition monitor in my office, savoring every single second of their impotent, flailing rage. The time for observing through a digital screen had officially passed. It was time to face them in person. I stood up from my executive desk and smoothed my hands down the front of my clothing. I was not wearing the damp, sweat-soaked pajamas they had last seen me in when they left me shivering on the floor. I was wearing an impeccable tailored, charcoal gray designer suit paired with a crisp white silk blouse and expensive polished heels. My hair was styled perfectly, my makeup was flawless, and my skin glowed with the absolute radiance of a woman who had fully recovered her physical strength and completely reclaimed her power. I walked out of my office, my heels clicking sharply against the new luxury vinyl flooring, and made my way to the entryway. I reached out and pulled open the heavy steel core front door. The solid click of the latch echoed across the front lawn, instantly cutting through the chaotic shouting at the gate. Trevor, Linda, and Rachel all froze simultaneously, their heads snapping toward the front porch. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, standing at the top of the concrete steps, and looked down the long manicured pathway at the three of them. The sheer, unadulterated shock that washed over their faces was an absolute masterpiece. They were staring at me, as if they had just seen a ghost materialize in broad daylight. Trevor's mouth literally dropped open, his eyes widening to comical proportions as his brain struggled to process the visual information in front of him. He had fully expected to find me either dead, hospitalized, or at the very least a weak, broken, sobbing mess curled up on the living room couch. Instead, he was staring at a fiercely independent, highly successful corporate executive who looked like she owned the entire world. The stark, undeniable contrast between my pristine, powerful appearance and their filthy, exhausted, humiliated state was beautifully poetic. I walked slowly down the pathway toward the wrought iron gates, my posture straight, and my gaze entirely fixed on my husband. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the incredibly heavy silence stretch out, forcing them to endure the agonizing anticipation of my arrival. Marcus respectfully took a single step backward as I approached, yielding the center position to me, but remaining close enough to intervene if Trevor attempted to reach through the metal bars. Trevor's initial shock quickly morphed back into his default state of aggressive, entitled arrogance. He gripped the iron bars again, pressing his face close to the gaps in the metal. He demanded to know what the hell I thought I was doing. He yelled at me to immediately call off my ridiculous rent, a cop open the gates, and let his family inside the house. He tried to use the exact same condescending, authoritative tone he had used for our entire marriage, barking orders at me as if I were a disobedient child who had taken a joke slightly too far. He actually had the sheer audacity to tell me to stop playing these stupid dramatic games because they were tired from their long flight and just wanted to go to sleep. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I did not ask him why he left me to die, or why he spent my money on a fake wedding, or why his mother stole my grandmother's diamonds. I felt absolutely no anger in that moment, only a cold, detached, clinical amusement. I looked at his bloodshot eyes, his greasy hair, and his stained shirt, and I simply smiled. It was a cold, empty, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of a woman who had already won the war before the other side even realized the first battle had begun. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of heavy stock paper. I stepped right up to the wrought iron gate, stopping just inches away from where Trevor was gripping the metal bars. I slowly slid the crisp white document through the narrow gap in the iron, holding it out for him to take. Trevor looked at the paper, then back up at my face, his arrogant expression faltering slightly as a tiny flicker of genuine unease finally registered in his eyes. He snatched the document from my fingers, aggressively snapping the paper open with a flick of his wrist. I expected it to be some sort of crazy emotional letter, or perhaps a list of angry, hysterical wife demands. Instead, his eyes darted across the highly formal structured legal text printed on the page. It was the official court-approved 14-day eviction notice, stamped and certified by the City Housing Authority, explicitly citing a breach of contract for non-payment of rent. I watched his eyes scan the document, tracking the realization as it slowly dawned on him. He read his own name listed as the defaulting tenant. He read the bold capitalized letters commanding the immediate vacating of the premises. He looked up at me, the paper trembling slightly in his filthy hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sudden, incomprehensible shift in his reality. He still did not understand the full scope of what was happening, but he finally understood that he had lost access to his sanctuary. I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice perfectly level and steady, carrying clearly across the quiet, sunlit suburban driveway. You do not live here anymore, Trevor. You are currently trespassing on private corporate property. The silence that followed my cold declaration was absolute but brief. Linda was the first to break the shock, pushing past her exhausted son to press her flushed face against the iron bars of the newly installed security gate. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street, a sound born of pure delusion and deep denial. She screamed that I had finally lost my mind and was making a fool of myself. She pointed an accusatory finger at my designer suit and yelled that Trevor was the absolute breadwinner of our family. Her voice grew increasingly shrill as she proudly listed his supposed accomplishments to Marcus, as if the armed security guard cared about her son's fake dominance. She loudly declared that Trevor paid the enormous $6,000 monthly rent for this luxury property, pulling his weight while I played with spreadsheets. She stubbornly insisted that because he paid the rent, he was a highly respected financial provider with ironclad legal tenant rights that no rental cop could ignore. She demanded that Marcus arrest me for stealing her son's home. Rachel immediately chimed in from the background, shivering in her dirty sweatpants and shouting that I was a manipulative leech trying to illegally steal her brother's hard-earned house while he was taking a European vacation. Trevor seemed to briefly regain his footing, foolishly fueled by his mother's aggressive defense. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the old intimidating posture he used to silence me during our marriage. He demanded that I open the heavy iron gate immediately before he called his expensive lawyer to sue me. He confidently claimed that I had absolutely no legal authority to issue any kind of eviction notice because I did not even own the property. He smugly reminded me that a large corporate management firm owned the house and that he was their primary leaseholder in excellent standing. He told me I was acting hysterical, embarrassing him in front of the neighborhood and ruining his return trip. He ordered me to step aside, deactivate the alarm system, and let the real master of the house walk through the front door. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, cry, or rush to interrupt his pathetic, arrogant monologue. I simply stood there on the sunlit concrete looking serene and let him finish his spectacular tantrum. I watched him dig his own grave deeper with every single word that spilled from his mouth. When he finally ran out of breath and stood panting against the bars, I calmly reached back into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a second set of thick, heavily watermarked legal documents clipped together in a neat portfolio. These were not standard housing forms or simple letters of demand. They were highly secure certified state business registrations, complex tax filings, and comprehensive corporate ownership records. I stepped even closer to the heavy wrought iron gate, holding the thick stack of papers up, so the bright afternoon sun illuminated the crisp black text for him to read. I did not yell. I simply pointed my polished fingernail to the bold capitalized heading at the absolute top of the first page. It explicitly identified the exact corporate property management firm that Trevor so proudly paid his $6,000 rent to on the first day of every single month. I watched his bloodshot, exhausted eyes carefully track my finger as it slowly slid down the official document. I guided his gaze past the registered corporate address, past the complex tax identification numbers, and rested my finger firmly on the designated line, identifying the sole proprietor of the entire holding company. I waited in the glorious heavy silence for his tired eyes to read the name clearly printed there. It was my name, Amber. I watched the arrogant, entitled smirk instantly dissolve from his unwashed face, replaced immediately by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. I slowly and methodically explained the devastating reality of our entire marriage to him, making sure my voice carried clearly to his mother and sister standing just behind him. I told him that I had quietly purchased this beautiful property through my newly formed limited liability company exactly 4 years ago. Using the significant profits from the expanding forensic accounting firm, he always mocked and dismissed as a stupid spreadsheet hobby. The undeniable truth hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He physically stumbled backward, his hands falling away from the iron bars. Every single month, when he proudly transferred his $6,000 rent payment to the faceless management company, boasting about being the supreme provider, he had actually been depositing his money directly into my private corporate bank account. He had never been providing for me. He had been unknowingly financing my secret wealth for years, funding the very investments that would ultimately destroy his life. I watched his mind frantically try to process the crushing magnitude of his own spectacular stupidity. He had willingly drained his personal savings to pay for a lavish Italian villa and a fake wedding with a greedy mistress, relying entirely on the arrogant assumption that he could seamlessly come back to America and resume his comfortable life. Instead, he had literally handed me the financial capital I needed to permanently solidify my independent empire. He was entirely homeless, completely penniless, stranded outside and legally evicted by the wife he thought he had discarded. He gripped his head with both hands, pulling at his greasy hair, his breathing turning into ragged, panicked gasps. He looked exactly like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was finally looking down at the jagged rocks rushing up to meet him. I smiled warmly and informed him that because he missed his last rent payment due to his accounts being permanently frozen, the eviction was legal, swift, and irreversible. He had absolutely no tenant rights, no home, and absolutely no money to fight me. The trap had snapped entirely shut. Linda and Rachel stared at me in stunned, horrified silence. The shrill arrogance drained from their exhausted bodies. The realization of what this meant for their futures was equally catastrophic. They had actively conspired to discard me, expecting to easily slide back into his luxurious life with his shiny new bride. They had happily destroyed their own comfortable routines, gleefully abandoned me on the dark floor to suffer alone, and spent every last cent they could beg or steal to attend a spectacular wedding that never happened. Now they were standing on a hot concrete driveway with scuffed designer luggage, smelling of cheap hostels, and staring blankly at the impenetrable fortress of the woman they had always severely underestimated. Linda slowly sank to her shaking knees on the grass, her dirty hands covering her pale face as she completely broke down into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs. Rachel immediately collapsed next to her mother on the curb, clutching her stained sweatpants, weeping loudly and hysterically as the incredibly cold, harsh reality of their irreversible ruin washed over her. They had absolutely nothing left to their names anymore. Trevor simply stood frozen at the wrought iron gate, staring blankly at the glowing red light of the polished biometric lock, watching his carefully constructed world reduce to ashes. The house of cards had completely burned to the ground. The masterful purge of my life was finally completely finished. I let the silence hold until Trevor finally tore his gaze away from the red biometric scanner and looked at me. Linda and Rachel remained on the grass behind him, their sobs fading into exhausted whimpers as the neighbors watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Marcus stood beside the stone pillar, calm and watchful, making it clear that none of them would cross the gate by force. Trevor opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another lie or demand one final favor, but I raised my hand before he could speak. The ownership documents had taken away the house he believed he controlled, yet the consequences waiting for him extended far beyond the property line. I had removed his access, exposed his default, and ended his illusion of authority. Now I needed to show him where the remains of his former life had been placed. I reached into the right pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and closed my fingers around the small brass key I had put there that morning. I slowly withdrew my hand, holding a single dull brass key between my thumb and index finger. I held it up so the afternoon sunlight glinted off its jagged edges. Trevor stared at the key, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He clearly had no idea what it was or what it represented. With a swift, casual flick of my wrist, I tossed the key directly through the narrow gap in the wrought iron gate. It hit the concrete driveway with a sharp, metallic clatter and slid to a stop right at the toe of his scuffed leather shoe. He looked down at it, then back up at my face, a silent question burning in his exhausted eyes. I let a cold, detached smile touch my lips before I spoke, making sure my voice was loud enough for his weeping mother and sister to hear every single word. I told him that the key at his feet belonged to a cheap, unventilated, ground-level storage unit located in a sketchy industrial park on the absolute furthest edge of town. I explained that I had hired a professional moving crew the very day after he left for his fake wedding in Italy. I had instructed them to meticulously pack up every single item he owned, along with all the expensive designer clothing, luxury handbags, and high-end cosmetics Linda and Rachel had greedily left behind in my guest rooms. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. Their entire lavish wardrobes, the physical symbols of their unearned status, had been unceremoniously dumped into a dark, dusty corrugated metal box, miles away from their comfortable suburban bubble. I casually informed them that the first month of rent for the storage unit was fully paid, but if they failed to cover the next payment, the facility management would legally auction off all their precious belongings to the highest bidder. Trevor slowly bent down and picked up the brass key, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the cheap metal. He now fully understood that there was absolutely nothing left for him inside the fortress standing behind me. But the physical eviction was only the beginning of his absolute ruin. I reached down and picked up a massive, thick manila folder resting on the stone pillar beside the security keypad. The folder was heavy, packed tightly with hundreds of pages of highly detailed legal documents, sworn affidavits, and indisputable forensic evidence. I stepped close to the gate and forcefully shoved the thick stack of papers through the metal bars, pressing it directly into his chest. Trevor instinctively wrapped his arms around the heavy folder, clutching it, as if it were a life preserver in a raging storm. I looked him dead in the eyes and calmly began to outline the sheer magnitude of the legal nightmare contained within those pages. I told him the first section was the official petition for an absolute contested divorce, filed with extreme prejudice, explicitly citing severe financial fraud, egregious marital dissipation of assets, and blatant documented infidelity. I assured him that the family court judge had already reviewed the preliminary evidence and had granted an immediate total freeze on any remaining shared accounts, effectively stripping him of any access to marital funds. I watched him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his stained shirt collar. Then I leaned in slightly closer and lowered my voice to a sharp, penetrating register. I told him to look at the second section of the folder. I explained that it contained a massive, comprehensive civil lawsuit naming him, Linda and Rachel, as active co-defendants. I watched Linda's head snap up from the grass, her tear-streaked face suddenly frozen in terror. I meticulously described the charges, detailing how we were suing them for intentional infliction of severe emotional distress and reckless endangerment. I reminded him of the precise moment he intentionally deactivated the power and water to our home during a freezing cold snap, knowing I was suffering from a severe lung infection. I told him we had sworn affidavits from the clinic doctors and comprehensive documentation of the stolen antibiotics and my missing emergency inhaler. I made it absolutely clear that I was coming after them for every single dollar they had stolen, plus extensive punitive damages that would financially cripple them for the rest of their natural lives. The final blow was the most exquisite. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the back of the thick folder. I casually mentioned that the final section contained a comprehensive certified forensic audit detailing every single cent he had systematically embezzled from my private accounts to fund his lavish European affair with Brittany. Trevor looked down at the folder, his breathing shallow and rapid. I smiled, letting the final piece of the trap snap shut. I informed him that I had not only given the audit to my aggressive legal team, but I had also personally forwarded the entire highly detailed report directly to the senior executive board at his corporate employer. I explained how the audit conclusively proved he had repeatedly used their secure company servers and specialized corporate software to facilitate his financial fraud and conduct his illicit affair during business hours. Trevor dropped the brass key. It hit the concrete with a dull clink. He stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror, as the ultimate reality of his situation crushed his arrogant spirit. I took one slow, deliberate step backward away from the heavy iron gate. I told him he was already officially fired today. The words hung in the air, sharp and absolute. Trevor stared at me, his jaw slack, the heavy folder of evidence slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. He had nothing left to say, no arrogant comebacks, no threats of legal action. The realization that his prestigious career, his lavish income, and his unearned social standing had vanished in a matter of seconds left him completely paralyzed. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I simply turned around, walked back up the pristine concrete pathway, and stepped inside my beautiful home. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, permanently sealing him outside in the ruins of his own spectacular failures. Several long, agonizing weeks passed, and the thick dust from their incredibly catastrophic landing finally settled into a bleak, unforgiving reality. The comprehensive ruin I had orchestrated was absolute. Trevor quickly discovered that corporate executives do not look kindly upon employees who use secure company servers to embezzle funds and facilitate international affairs. The forensic audit I provided left his former employer with no choice but to press formal criminal charges. I was currently facing multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The assets he previously relied on were frozen in the divorce proceedings, leaving him entirely unable to retain the high-powered defense attorneys he so desperately needed to afford even the absolute most basic legal representation. My formerly arrogant, expensive suit-wearing husband was forced to take a humiliating minimum wage job, working the long overnight shift at a local gas station. I received occasional updates from mutual acquaintances who had stopped in for coffee at 2 in the morning, only to find Trevor wearing a cheap polyester uniform, sweeping mop water across sticky linoleum floors. His designer watches and custom shoes were gone, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it aged him a decade in a single month. His miserable mother and sister were certainly not faring any better. With their designer wardrobes auctioned off by the storage facility after they failed to make the second rent payment, Linda and Rachel had retreated to the darkest, cheapest edges of the city. They were currently living in a horribly cramped, dimly lit, and run-down motel located right off the loud interstate. It was the kind of establishment with a buzzing, half-broken neon vacancy sign and the permanent, suffocating stench of stale cigarette smoke embedded in the cheap carpet. There were no luxurious brunches, no manicures, and certainly no European vacations. They were barely surviving on incredibly cheap microwave dinners, trapped in a single room together, turning their bitter resentment entirely upon each other. But financial devastation was only the foundational layer of my revenge. The final, most devastating blow was the complete social execution of my in-laws. Linda had spent her entire adult life meticulously cultivating a pristine image among the local country club elite and her extended family. She valued her social standing above air itself. It was time to permanently strip that away from her. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I sat at my home office desk, sipping artisan coffee, and opened my laptop. I had carefully compiled the digital files I had saved from the night they left me shivering on the floor. I selected the crystal clear audio recordings captured by the indoor Ring cameras and the exported text message threads between Linda and Rachel. The files explicitly detailed them laughing as I coughed uncontrollably in the dark. The audio clearly captured Linda, instructing Rachel to move my emergency inhaler and my prescribed antibiotics to the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, far completely out of my weakened reach. It recorded their cruel, mocking laughter as they joked about how my severe lung infection would keep me quiet and out of their way while they packed for Italy. I attached these horrific files to a single carefully worded email. I did not add any emotional commentary or dramatic accusations. I simply stated that I wanted to clarify the circumstances surrounding my sudden divorce and their subsequent eviction. I hit send, blasting the undeniable evidence to the official country club membership directory, the entire extended family mailing list, and every single prominent socialite Linda had ever proudly called a friend. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly spectacular. In the modern age, digital evidence of such profound cruelty spreads like wildfire. By noon, the audio clips of Linda and Rachel, mocking a severely ill woman, were circulating through local neighborhood group chats and private social media circles. The sheer sociopathic nature of their actions shocked the comfortable suburban community to its core. Nobody wants to be associated with people who actively hide life-saving medication from a sick family member so they can enjoy a luxury vacation. The social exile was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Within 48 hours, the country club board of directors convened an emergency meeting and formally revoked Linda's membership, citing a violation of their community moral conduct clauses. When Rachel attempted to go to her favorite upscale salon, the manager quietly asked her to leave, explaining that the other clients felt deeply uncomfortable with her presence. The extended family, aunts and uncles who had previously adored Linda, completely severed all ties. They blocked her phone number, returned her letters unopened, and explicitly banned her from upcoming holiday gatherings. Linda and Rachel were effectively ghosts, entirely exiled from the modern society they so desperately craved. They could not show their faces in their old neighborhoods without receiving looks of absolute disgust from former friends. They were trapped in their dingy motel room, isolated from the world, fully aware that their true, ugly nature was public knowledge. They had traded a comfortable, luxurious life for a fake wedding, and in the process, they had permanently destroyed their reputations. The purge was flawlessly executed, and as I looked out my window at the peaceful lake, I felt nothing but the deep, satisfying warmth of total justice. 6 months later, early autumn bathed my remodeled estate in a spectacular glow. The physical transformation mirrored my internal rebirth. Gone were the dark colors and heavy furniture Trevor had insisted upon. I had gutted the interior, replacing the suffocating atmosphere with open spaces, expansive walls of pristine glass, and sleek modern finishes reflecting the bright sun. It was a formidable fortress, and tonight it was the backdrop for the greatest professional triumph of my life. I stood on the newly constructed deck, watching with profound satisfaction as professional caterers moved seamlessly through the elegantly dressed guests. Sophisticated melodies of a live string quartet drifted across the manicured lawns, blending perfectly with the joyful hum of conversation and clinking crystal glasses. I was hosting the highly anticipated launch party for my newly expanded forensic accounting firm. What had once been a solitary operation run from a spare bedroom had blossomed into a formidable corporate entity, managing high-profile accounts nationwide. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my emerald green evening gown. The luxurious silk draped perfectly over my healthy frame. My severe illness was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant energy of a woman who had fought back from the brink of destruction. I moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting esteemed guests with genuine warmth. My loyal friends, the people who stood by me when I built my empire in secret, laughed near the custom outdoor bar. Surrounding them were top-tier corporate clients and highly respected legal professionals who valued my unmatched expertise. A distinguished waiter paused beside me, offering a silver tray lined with flutes of vintage champagne. I picked one up, feeling the cool crystal against my fingertips, and made my way toward the center of the expansive deck. As I stepped up to the edge of the illuminated swimming pool, the chatter of the crowd began to naturally quiet down. Faces turned toward me, their expressions reflecting genuine admiration and profound respect. These were people who celebrated authentic success, built on raw intelligence and unwavering determination. I raised my glass high into the cool evening air, the golden bubbles catching the glow of the overhead string lights. The musicians gracefully lowered their instruments, allowing a heavy, anticipatory silence to settle over the magnificent gathering. I looked around at the faces of my friends, dedicated employees, and valued clients, feeling a surge of pure gratitude wash over my soul. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this incredible milestone. I began, my voice carrying clearly across the beautiful estate. This expansion represents so much more than professional growth. It represents the undeniable power of truth, the absolute necessity of resilience, and the beautiful reality of starting over. Many of you know the hard work it took to build this firm. You know the long nights and the commitment to exposing deception. But this moment right now is about looking strictly forward, about embracing the boundless potential of the future we are building together. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the crowd, feeling fiercely independent and now immensely wealthy. I was completely healed, not just physically from the infection that had nearly claimed my life, but emotionally from the years of insidious manipulation I had endured. The toxic weight of Trevor's endless demands, Linda's suffocating arrogance, and Rachel's petty cruelty had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. I had expertly excised them from my existence, leaving behind a pristine, unblemished canvas upon which I could paint my own magnificent destiny. To absolute independence I declared, projecting my voice with powerful, resonant clarity. To the strength we find in our darkest moments, to the unwavering courage it takes to demand what we truly deserve, and to the brilliant, limitless future that awaits us all. To the future, the crowd echoed in joyous unison, raising their glasses high, before taking a long celebratory sip. The string quartet resumed playing an upbeat, triumphant melody, and the party instantly flared back to vibrant life around me. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the delicious aromas of the catered feast. I stepped back, allowing the celebration to continue, and walked toward the quiet edge of the property line. I leaned against the stone railing and looked out over the dark lake. The water was perfectly still, a dark mirror reflecting countless stars. I stood in the shadows, breathing the autumn air, saturated with ultimate victory. I had planned and executed the total demolition of my husband's world. I stripped him of his home, dismantled his career, exposed his infidelity, and destroyed his social standing. I watched his arrogant mother and entitled sister collapse into loud ruin on my concrete driveway, reduced to absolute nothingness by their own spectacular greed. Looking out over the magnificent estate I owned, free and clear, a profound realization settled into my bones. The sweetest revenge was never about destroying them. It was merely a clinical act of removing an infection. The true triumph, the real victory that made my heart beat with such powerful rhythm, was the undeniable proof of my own absolute capability. For years, Trevor had desperately wanted me to believe that my intelligence and work ethic were nothing more than an insignificant hobby. He needed me to feel small, so his inflated ego could feel massive. I had taken the very tools he mocked and used them to construct a glittering fortress. Every dollar in my expansive accounts, every square foot of this breathtaking property, and every ounce of the profound respect I commanded from my peers was entirely my own. I had not once relied on a wealthy spouse, a stolen inheritance, or a lucky break. I had built this magnificent, beautiful reality with my own two hands, my own brilliant mind, and my own unbreakable, resilient spirit. I slowly turned back to look at the glowing, vibrant party, feeling entirely complete, perfectly whole, and completely untouchable. I was Amber, the sole architect of my own extraordinary empire. Amber's victory was not the public humiliation of the people who betrayed her. That humiliation was only the consequence of evidence, contracts, and choices they had made themselves. Her real victory was the life visible beyond the glass doors, a thriving firm, loyal colleagues, a home shaped by her own taste, and a future no one else could control. Trevor had spent years insisting that her intelligence was merely a hobby because admitting the truth would have exposed how dependent he was on the woman he mocked. Linda and Rachel had mistaken quiet discipline for weakness and access to Amber's generosity for entitlement. Their greatest error was believing that kindness erased boundaries. Amber survived because she had built knowledge, financial independence, and the courage to act when the truth became impossible to ignore. She did not need their approval to become powerful, and she did not need their destruction to become whole. By the time the gates closed behind them, she had already recovered the only things that truly mattered: her safety, her name, her work, and complete ownership of her future. The estate no longer represented a failed marriage. It stood as proof that rebuilding could be quieter, stronger, and permanent. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of betrayal, cold justice, and ultimate personal triumph. I invite you to share your own stories in the comments below about a time you had to rebuild your life from the ground up after being underestimated or betrayed. Let us know the steps you took to find the inner strength to forge your own path. If Amber's journey to absolute independence resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs a powerful reminder of their own unshakable worth. Remember, the best revenge is simply becoming the architect of your own extraordinary life.